hosted by the Happiness Institute at Oxford in association with Going Life and Oxford University Psychology Society. Today we are talking with Professor Martin Seligman. He is currently director of the Positive Psychology Center and Zellerbach Family Professor of Psychology, previously director of clinical training at the University of Pennsylvania. His legacy is best remembered as founding the field of positive psychology as the president of the American Psychological Association in 1998. He's developed the theory of learned helplessness, optimism, and pioneered the well-being theory known as Perma. So welcome, Professor Seligman. It's an absolute honor to have you here with us today.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure to work with you on this good cause.
So before we start, I wanted to mention that we will have a live Q&A session with our audience in the end. So you can start posting your questions either on our Facebook or YouTube live stream. So I thought that I would like to start the interview with a very familiar question. Professor Seligman, because we're very nice, unlike CNN, without any word limit, what is the state of psychology today?
Well, the joke that I used to tell all the time, I haven't told it in more than a decade, was an interview in CNN in which they asked me, what is the state of psychology today? And I said, good. And they said, we can see you're not very comfortable with CNN. You can have more words than that. So they asked me again, what is the state of psychology today? I said, not good. And they said, okay, we'll give you 3 words this time. What is the state of psychology today? And not good enough. And that continues to be the state of psychology, I think.
So has psychology, in your opinion, not become good enough, even looking more than 10 years after your 2008 TED Talk?
Well, I think the weak point of psychology has been the looseness of application. So I think psychology, unlike physics and chemistry, which had engineerings before they became basic scientists, so they predicted artillery shells and eclipses and floods. So people knew what to work on, the basic scientists. But psychology never really had an engineering. It never had something that worked. So psychology immediately started to imitate, a century ago, physics and chemistry and do basic science. But the question was, what is it basic to? And so for me, psychology goes the other way around. It's essentially an engineering at this stage. And the question is, what works with human beings? And what works should tell us what basic research we should do. I'm a basic researcher, but I've spent my life doing applications for exactly that reason. I wanted to know what I was working on, and I didn't want to be a wanker.
As we've mentioned in the introduction, you were very influential in developing the theory of learned helplessness in depression, which studies extremely miserable people. Where did you find the inspiration to found positive psychology and studying extremely happy people instead? Has there been a drastic change in how you did research?
Well, when I became president of the American Psychological Association 20 years ago, I asked what were psychologists good at? What did we do well? And we did suffering moderately well. We could measure it, depression, alcoholism, schizophrenia, and pharmacologically and psychologically, we had mildly to moderately effective interventions. But what we didn't have was the question of what makes life worth living. So psychology was about what cripples life. And the question was, let's say you got rid of everything that crippled life. Would you have life worth living? And it seemed to me the answer was no, that people wanted more than just not to be miserable. So with a bunch of good scientists and good applied people, we began a field called positive psychology, in which we asked the question, what enables the good life? What is there over and above the absence of misery?
And so one distinction that definitely needs to be made is the difference between happyology and positive psychology. What's the actual difference?
Well, happyology is about mood and feeling good. And that's one of the five criteria, one of the five bulwarks of what people who are not suffering and who are free want. They want to feel good. They want to be happy. They want happyology. But there are four other things they want, which are not about smiling or being merry or feeling good. Uh, so the first I call P, positive emotion, happyology. The second is engagement, being totally wrapped up in what you're doing, being wrapped up in love or in a conversation or in your work. So E, engagement, is the second thing that people choose. And that's not about feeling good. In fact, that's about the mind being blank and about being in flow. The third thing that people want over and above feeling good is relationships. Uh, we are like termites and wasps and ants. We're social creatures. We've evolved to have relationships. Or the fourth thing we want, which is not about feeling good and often antagonizes happyology, is meaning and purpose in life, belonging to and serving something we think is bigger than the self. And the final thing we want, again, which is not smiling and being merry, is A, accomplishment and achievement. So human beings seek out for the good life, Perma, positive emotion, which is feeling good, engagement, which is being in flow, R, relationships, M, meaning, and A, accomplishment.
So would that be how you define what a good life or a flourishing life would be?
Well, um, the closest I can come to defining it is to say that there are the five components: Perma, positive emotion, engagement, good relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. But people value those elements differently. So there's no one formula for anyone. So some of my friends are hedonists and they just want P. They just want to feel good. And we know a lot about uh, feeling good. We know a lot about savoring, about orgasm, about back massages, about merriment. But people like me are not high hedonic people. Rather, we're meaning and engagement and accomplishment people. And so for me, how much meaning one has in life and how much one accomplishes are what my measure of a good life is. But importantly, with five different elements of well being, of the good life, different people have different weights. And so it depends on what you value. And positive psychology is not about telling you what you should value. Rather, it's if you tell me what you value is relationships, then I can point to the science about how to improve relationships and the like. So to dashboard, no one definition of what the good life is.
So is there any empirical evidence or is there any experiments that can support the idea that perhaps Perma is the dashboard of how we can define the good life?
I don't think it's really an empirical question. It's a theoretically plausible issue that the five basic elements that people who are not suffering and are not oppressed seek is Perma. But people have said there's another one or another two, and that's a matter, again, not so much of empirical data, but of theoretical coherence. So people have said that it's really Perma plus V, vitality or physical health. So vitality and physical health is a sixth element. Other people have said it's R, another R, responsibility, control, and accountability. And those are all plausible. But at any rate, I don't think the Perma theory is it's a philosophical approach that says, here are 5 plausible components. Let's run with them and let's see if we can improve on them.
So one problem that came up when we were talking to Paul Bloom last week was the issue of reproducibility. Do you think that's an issue in positive psychology research, and is open science or pre-registration common?
Positive psychology does about as well as other forms of social and clinical and cognitive psychology. It is by and large reproducible, and the technique of meta-analysis tells you the things that are reproducible. But there are also demonstration experiments that occur that don't replicate, and that happens at about the same rate in every form of psychology I know. So what science is about is not getting it perfectly right the first time. You might get it wrong. You might get 180-degree wrong, but criticism, meta-analysis is the corrective here.
Especially recently, there has been a massive surge of interest in people who do want to study happiness, not necessarily positive psychology. How do we, as members of the general public, distinguish between which ones are interventions that actually work and which ones are relatively rubbish?
Well, you have to read the literature and look at the continuation in science. And so, for example, this morning I was just reading a critical article about interventions in positive education. So the questions are which ones work and which ones don't work. And so I have to turn to the growing literature on meta-analysis, in which there are at least 20 interventions that have been proposed to increase Perma, often to increase life satisfaction. And you have to look at the meta-analysis. And so, for example, 3 blessings, that is, every night before you go to bed, thinking of things that went well today, seems to reliably, across several dozen studies, increase life satisfaction and decrease depression. Meta-analysis seems to say that. On the other hand, there's quite a lot of controversy about meditation. So is meditation a reliable increaser of Perma? And again, there are some studies that show it and some that don't show it, but by and large, for anti-anxiety, meditation seems to reliably work better than placebos. Not yet clear to me that it works reliably better than placebos for depression, for example. So again, what science is about is to look at each of the different interventions and ask, what is the reliability that it will work? And we're getting to a stage in which we can say with some confidence there are at least 6 interventions that reliably increase Perma. There are another 10 that probably do, and then there are another bunch that are controversial and may or may not work.
So at the end of the day, we still have to refer back to the primary literature and actually read what the meta-analysis would tell us.
Yes, and to accumulating techniques in which replication, meta-analysis, changing the procedures and seeing if they're robust across rich people, poor people, black people, white people. That's all part of the nature of a science which takes criticism and seriously.
And that will be particularly important because psychology is a bit weird, the acronym for white.
Well, I think it's true in every field that I know.
Yeah.
So I know pharmacology reasonably well. And again, for antidepressant drugs, for anti-anxiety medications, there's exactly the same reproducibility issue. And what you have to rely on is accumulating science, meta-analysis, improved experimental designs. So pretty much every science that I know has a reproducibility problem, and it gets solved by criticism, response to criticism, and re-replication.
So for the last few questions, I wanted to focus more on what's happening now and also prospect on what's going to happen in the future. Globally, we're under the threat of the coronavirus. Is it possible for us to actually find happiness or positivity in our lives? And how can we actually do that?
Well, this is a very interesting question, of course, for you, me, and all the people watching. And I can give you my theoretically based hunch about infectious illness. So it's important to distinguish between different kinds of positivity and what their effect is on infectious illness. So Sheldon Cohn did two very elegant experiments in which he injected rhinovirus, which I think is a coronavirus, into the nose of people, 300 volunteers, and then isolated them for 2 weeks. And he asked who got a cold and who didn't get a cold. And of course, beforehand, he measured the panoply of psychological variables. And he found, interestingly, that optimistic people, people whose cognition I've worked on most of my life, that the future will work out, that bad events are temporary. Being an optimist did not prevent getting a severe cold. What did prevent getting a severe cold was being a cheerful, merry, high positive emotion person. Now, that's important because its message is the best we can guess. During isolation, during coronavirus, you should be trying to have as much fun as you possibly can. Now, it's difficult, you're isolated, and so the question of being happy is, what do you do? Well, we bought a puppy. And by the way, we're not the only people in the world to do that. There's a puppy shortage now. People have caught on that in isolation, a puppy really brings more happiness. Sex during the coronavirus, very important. Make love as much as you can. Listen to the music, dance, do the things that produce positive affectivity during the pandemic. That's the best guess I can make. But how about as the pandemic wanes? What's important then? Who's going to pick up the pieces? Who's going to restart the economy? Who's going to lead? And there, the evidence is it's not the cheerful, merry, happy-go-lucky people who are the good leaders here. Rather, it's the optimists, the people who have hope, the people who believe that bad events are temporary, that they'll go away, and that human beings can do something about them. So the best message I have here, best guess from positive psychology, is during the threat, as hard as it is, put as much happiness as you can into your life. But as the pandemic wanes, what we want in our leaders, in our managers, in people who are we want hope and optimism.
Very strong message, and thank you so much for that. So I was wondering, just finally,
I have one thing more to say about it. It's not something I invented, but it's from 650 years ago, during the bubonic plague in England in the 1360s. There was a monk called Julian of Norwich. It was actually a female monk, Juliana, but you could only publish if you were male, so she was Julian. And she said something very important, something we should all be reminded of now. Here's what she said. He said not, thou shalt not be travailed. He said not, thou shalt not be tempesteth. He said not, thou shalt not be diseased. He said, thou shalt not be overcome. And all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. And she was right.
So it is the ones who are optimistic and who believe that we can build resilience from this pandemic that will lead us through and actually help bring the world back to normal.
Yes, I'm very optimistic. I'm old enough to have lived through Hitler and Stalin, and Julian of Norwich lived through a plague that was much worse than what we have. And these things pass away. And human progress, as bumpy as it is, has been up for the last 500 years. Less violence, more education, higher standard of living, higher recovery of diseases, more music, more books. And so there's every reason to be hopeful about human progress.
So I guess finally, before I hand this over to my colleague at the Oxford University Psychology Society, to Lauren for a live Q&A with our audience, I wanted to go back to where we started at the very beginning of our discussion. So Professor Seligman, where do you see the state of positive psychology in 10 years?
Well, I think it's part of accumulating science. I think the main interest is what applications in health, in education, in corporations, in the growth of tolerance and world peace work and what do not work. So I see accumulating work on what is effective and what is not effective in education, in health, in the corporation, and in human relations as the 10-year future of positive psychology.
Thank you so much. Lauren?
Thank you so much for that. So we've got some questions from our live Q&A from our audience, and I really like this question. Your institute is called the Authentic Happiness Institute, but how do you objectively measure happiness in an individual?
Well, for me, there are 5 things that you want to measure. And as I said at the beginning, only 1/5 of them is the measurement of how are you feeling right now. So there are a set of questions about life satisfaction on a 1 to 10 scale, where 1 is the conditions of my life are abysmal, and 10 is the conditions of my life are ideal. Where are you? So that's a typical measure of positive emotion. The second thing to measure is for happiness, well-being is, and by the way, the name of my institute is not Authentic Happiness. It's a positive psychology center. The second thing to measure is how engaged are you? The third, how good are your relationships? The fourth, how much meaning and purpose do you have in life? And fifth, how much accomplishment, achievement, and mastery do you have? So those are the 5 main arms of measurement of, quote, happiness, unquote. For me, the word well-being is a lot more suitable because happiness tends to connote the first, the smiley face, which I think is important in the pandemic, but not all the time.
Yeah. Okay. Next question. Can you induce, improve, or increase your happiness levels using technology or biotechnology?
I'm not terribly impressed that what plugs into the wall these days, biotechnology, much increases Perma. I think the increases in Perma tend to be human to human. So there's nothing I really know in biotechnology that I think is astonishingly important. Within electronic technology, the fact that you can measure very large groups of people, the fact that you can integrate huge amounts of data, and the fact that you can deliver interventions on a massive scale, it really is an improvement.
Looks like we have time for one more question. So, do you think that a national happiness level index, akin to a GDP measurement, is a useful or beneficial tool?
No, I think particularly in the wealthier parts of the world, GDP is increasingly out of touch with well-being. Basically, the relationship of life satisfaction to wealth, both in individuals and in nations, is powerfully curvilinear. And what that means is if you're very poor, then what you really want is more money. And GDP and well-being go up hand in hand. But once you get well above the safety net, in the United States, it's probably about $100,000 a year, increases in wealth do not produce much in the way of increases in Perma or well-being. So the basic message is that for the developed world, the allocation of resources to produce more and more consumer goods, more and more well-being, probably is a misallocation of resources if what you care about is increased human well-being.
Right. So on that note, thank you so much, Professor Seligman, for joining us and for your insight into positive psychology, well-being, and happiness. We all hope you enjoyed this live stream event as much as we did. And if you want to hear more talks and interviews with field-leading scientists, then please like, subscribe, and follow our social media channels at Gowing Life. And also do check out the Oxford University Psychology Society's podcast called Project Psychology. And if you'd like to revisit this talk, an edited version will be released as part of the Happiness Festival later in July, and we'll keep you updated. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.